his back and buttocks. On April 30th, 1996, Mark was charged with his first of many murder counts. He also had his first hearing on this date via video from his hospital bed. There were many lives affected that day. 35 people lost their lives, ranging in age from 3 to 72 years old, and additionally, 23 people were injured. To this day, the massacre is still the worst in Australian history. Jason Bernard Winter was a 23-year-old man who was killed by gunshots to his hand, neck, chest, and head. Jason had sought cover while the massacre was taking place. Once he thought the shooter had left, he came out of hiding and ran right into Mark, who then proceeded to shoot and kill him. Tony Kiston was a 51-year-old man who was visiting the Broad Arrow Cafe with his wife. When Mark first entered the cafe and opened fire, Tony selflessly pushed his wife under a table and sacrificed himself. His wife's life was spared, but Tony would lose his because of a single gunshot wound to his head. Carolyn Lofton was at the cafe having lunch with her 15-year-old daughter, Sarah, when Mark opened fire. Carolyn's life was saved. However, her daughter, Sarah, died from a single gunshot to her head. As mentioned in the beginning of this episode, Port Arthur is a historical site with a very interesting past. It started as a timber station in 1830 and a convict settlement. Port Arthur is where some of the harshest criminals were sent and was known for having very strict security measures. Food was used as both a reward and a punishment. Guards would reward convicts with larger portions of food, tea, sugar, and sometimes even tobacco. Food was also used as a harsh punishment. If you needed punishing, you were only given the bare minimum of bread and water. In 1834, the convicts started building ships. They constructed 15 large ships and 140 smaller boats. Only the well-behaved convicts were given the privilege of building the boats. The worst of the worst were sent to what was referred to as the separate prison. This special building was constructed after the main penitentiary was built and was meant to be used as a type of solitary confinement. When convicts were sent to the separate prison, they were ordered to wear a hood in complete darkness, and they were not able to speak to anyone. Many of the convicts that were sent to the separate prison developed mental illnesses due to the solitary confinement treatment. Since the settlement was constructed right on the Tasman Peninsula, they also had various docking stations around the peninsula for boats to pull up to. In addition to building ships and boats, the settlement also offered regular boat maintenance and upkeep to anyone who needed it. Those dockyards still stand today. In 1842, a flour mill and granary were built to offer additional jobs to the convicts. In 1848, the settlement stopped making ships altogether. The number of convicts that were sent to Port Arthur started dwindling slowly at first, but then more and more convicts were being taken away from the settlement. In 1877, the last convict was shipped out. That same year, the Port Arthur area was given to private interests, and they began logging almost immediately. The settlement was no longer known as Port Arthur, but now is referred to as Carnarvon. Several years later, there were 2 severe fires that ripped through Carnarvon. One fire was in 1895, and the second just 2 years later in 1897. Many of the original buildings that sat on the settlement were ruined from these fires, while others, such as the penitentiary, the separate prison, and the convict hospital, were completely gutted. The residents of Carnarvon did what they could to make Carnarvon a community. They added a post office and even a cricket club. By the 1920s and 30s, Carnarvon had 3 hotels and 2 museums. Almost all of the occupations that made up the community were tourist-related. In 1927, the residents reinstated the Port Arthur name. The settlement received funding in 1979 to restore and preserve the site as a tourist attraction. In 2016, Port Arthur had a population of just 251. In addition to the shops and cafes, the convict settlement is also referred to as an open-air museum. An open-air museum is a collection of buildings that are displayed outside. Many travelers from all over the world go to Port Arthur to see the ancient settlement, which made it the perfect opportunity for Mark to open fire. Mark was born on May 7, 1967, at the Queen Alexandra Hospital and was raised in Hobart, Tasmania, in Australia. He was raised in a relatively normal household, with a mom, dad, and sister, and as a baby, he was happy and content. Mark's mother did notice that Mark would reject all forms of physical affection while growing up, and would push away any hugs or snuggles. The issue didn't get better as he got older. In fact, it only got worse. He was very hard to handle even as a toddler. Mark was always wandering off, so much so that his mom would leave him on the house veranda tied up with a harness and leash surrounded by his toys to keep him busy and contained. As a toddler, he even swallowed a nail. Mark's mom also noticed that his speech development was rather slow. As soon as Mark started school, his parents noticed he began having even more issues. He was disruptive and sometimes even violent. Even as young as elementary school, Mark was aggressive, destructive, and tormented other children. Mark's teachers reported to his parents that Mark always seemed very distant and unemotional. At 10 years old, he was hospitalized because of burns he received from playing with fireworks.
I broke the stick trying to get out, but I couldn't, and it made a hole through my jeans.
Do you think you'll be playing with firecrackers anymore?
Yes.
Don't you think you've learned a lesson from this?
Yes, but I'm still playing with it.
According to his mother, Mark had a tendency to aggravate people, so he was always in trouble. Just like a lot of the other shooters we have covered in this podcast, Mark also had a history of being bullied in school. In 1980, Mark was moved to the special education unit at Newtown High School. When Mark turned 14, his father gave him an air rifle. Mark immediately started using the air rifle irresponsibly. He would shoot small animals and hide behind bushes, firing the rifle at cars as they drove by. One time, he shot a parrot out of a tree with the air rifle. When the helpless bird fell from the tree, he continued to shoot it in the head until the parrot was dead. On May 6, 1983, the day before Mark's 16th birthday, he left school and never returned. He was deemed unemployable because he would constantly upset and annoy people, making it impossible for him to hold a job.
Not until the psychiatrist told us. They said he would never ever be able to hold a position down, simply because he would aggravate people to such an extent that he'd always be in trouble.
Mark received a disability pension, but would also pick up odd jobs as a handyman and a gardener. In 1987, Mark met a 54-year-old woman who was very, very wealthy. Mark was only 19 years old when he befriended the woman and moved in with her into her mansion. While together, they spent a lot of money. They would go shopping almost every day and eat out at expensive restaurants. The woman's elderly mother also lived with them in that mansion. They were a rather odd trio. There were about 40 cats living in the garage and 14 dogs inside the house. In 1990, someone made a complaint to the health department, complaining about the dilapidated condition of the mansion. Not only were the animals using the home as their own bathroom, but there were also dirty dishes and trash everywhere. The elderly mother had an untreated broken hip as well as infected leg ulcers. She was taken to the hospital and later a nursing home where she eventually passed away. The woman also had health issues and had to spend a short amount of time in the hospital. A cleanup order was placed on the home, requiring it be cleaned before it's deemed habitable again. Mark and his father took it upon themselves to clean the mansion from top to bottom. In 1991, Mark and his lady friend moved to a 72-acre farm and once again started collecting animals. On October 20th, 1992, the woman was driving her vehicle with Mark in the passenger seat when, without warning, Mark leaned over and jerked the steering wheel out of the woman's hands. This was something he had done before, and whether it was a form of aggression or just joking around, no one really knew. This caused the woman to steer into oncoming traffic and caused a head-on collision. The woman died in a traffic accident while Mark was severely injured. He suffered from back and neck injuries, causing him to spend about 7 months in the hospital. The wealthy woman left everything she owned to Mark, including the 72-acre farm and the mansion. He received over $550,000 in assets. Because he quickly inherited a large amount of money, and his lack of maturity, Mark's mother took guardianship over him and his funds. Mark's father became the caretaker of the farm, while Mark lived at the family's home as he was still recovering. In August of 1993, Mark's father went missing. He was found on August 16, 1993, in a dam near the farmhouse, with a weight belt around his neck. His death was ruled suicide.
His father committed suicide, from what we understand, from the sheer burden of trying to keep this kid, who he loved but he knew could become dangerous, on a leash.
Because of Mark's father's death, Mark received approximately another $250,000. After the death of his father, Mark decided to sell the farmhouse and move back into the mansion. He was able to sell the farm for about $143,000. Not long after the death of his wealthy friend, who Mark claimed to never have a sexual relationship with, and the death of his father, Mark's mental status continued to deteriorate. His drinking increased, and in 1995 he became suicidal.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
Active shooter, reports of an active shooter,
mass casualty incidents.
Mark would also dress oddly. He would wear a gray linen suit, lizard skin shoes, a Panama hat, and would carry a briefcase. He also had an electric blue suit with flared trousers and a ruffled shirt. He would normally wear this outfit out to restaurants, where others would continuously make fun of him. Although he didn't seem to care about this, his suicidal thoughts and drinking increased greatly. Mark would drink half a bottle of Sambuca and a full bottle of Bailey's Irish Cream almost daily. In addition to the Sambuca and Bailey's, he also enjoyed drinking wine and other alcoholic drinks that were on the sweeter side. Shortly after the massacre, in an interview with police, Mark said that he had thought about the massacre anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks prior to the actual shooting. Mark was born with a personality disorder. He was intellectually impaired, and he was possibly on the autism spectrum. A court-appointed psychiatrist would later state that Mark was socially and intellectually impaired, but had no signs of schizophrenia or a mood disorder. One of the psychiatrists said that Mark was clearly a very disturbed person, but he was not mentally ill, and was competent to stand trial. Mark had a limited vocabulary, and couldn't read or write. When he spoke, he often misused and mispronounced words. Months before the shooting, Mark started taking antidepressant medications, but he reported to others that they weren't working, and he was still feeling depressed with suicidal thoughts. It was determined that Mark was mentally impaired as a result of low-level intelligence, and he had an IQ of only 66. For perspective, the average IQ in the United States is 98. As previously mentioned, Mark was charged with his first count of murder on April 30th, 1996, from his hospital bed via a court video system. His trial was set for November 7th, 1996. Initially, Mark pled not guilty to all charges, but would later change his plea to guilty. Mark later stated that he was pressured into giving a guilty plea by his defense attorney, Mark Avery. He pled guilty to 72 charges, some of which included murder, attempted murder, causing grievous bodily harm, and arson. On November 22, 1996, just 2 weeks after giving his guilty plea, Mark was sentenced to 35 life sentences, plus an additional 1,035 years without the possibility